So this might be too personal a topic to start with, but in a recent conversation, you mentioned that you had some experience with an open relationship, and that has always been something that's fascinated me because it's hard for me to imagine being able to pull it off myself. And normally, when I've encountered people who were experimenting with those kinds of relationships, it will look like some strangely morphed version of a more typical relationship. For instance, two people might be breaking up, but instead of breaking up, they're doing it in this very slow fashion that involves seeing other people. Um, and I have a close friend of mine who was recently in a relationship with a girl who was on her way out of a relationship with another guy. And, they had just opened it up, but then my friend fell for her pretty hard and it just becomes very complicated. However, I'm open to the idea that there are people who are mature enough and have a good enough system of communication that they're able to pull it off. And that doesn't mean it lasts forever. If you can do it in a way that doesn't break either person for, a couple years or even a year, that's really impressive. So whatever you're willing to share with me about your experience in that realm, I'd be fascinated by.
Yeah, no, interesting place to start. I
Sorry.
appreciate, no, it's fine. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it because, on some level, when the idea of an open relationship was first proposed to me, I kind of um went into it kicking and screaming a little bit. I mean, I trusted everyone involved, but it wasn't let's just say it wasn't my idea.
Mm,
Uh, but when I thought about it, um, a process relational understanding of reality does seem to lend itself to this more open style of relationship. And so I did feel like to be consistent, I should at least try it out. And um, so relationships are hard either way, whether you're monogamous or polyamorous. And you know, it seems to me that a lot of the time people who are monogamous, at least nominally, also have phases of their lives or periods in coming into a new relationship or leaving an old relationship where they're, for all intents and purposes, poly as well, right? And there's lots of infidelity, and so while we have these names for these two different relationship styles, and I'm sure there's lots of in between sort of approaches, but they're not as sharp cut. I mean, in reality, the way human beings relate to one another and how we talk about how we'd like to relate to one another are two very different things typically. Um, and so, yeah, I've experimented with that. I guess really over the last decade plus in different forms. And I don't regret it. It wasn't always easy. Communication becomes massively important, and there can be a lot of processing involved. Um, but going through that experience initially with some resistance and then coming to really appreciate it, I can say that I learned more about myself, my attachment style, um, and my attachment wounding than I otherwise would have. And certain emotions came to the surface that I would often describe as like almost instinctual in the sense that there's something at the species level that begins to surface when you mess with um, relationships and our expectations about commitment and um, what gets brought to the surface and made conscious as a result of pursuing an open relationship and really testing the strength and the trust involved in relationship. I think is it has been fruitful for me. um I think it's made me a more whole person, but you know, I also don't want to. There are a lot of people who push polyamory and non-monogamy and all these things as like more evolved or something, and I don't think that's true at all. I don't think anybody knows the first thing about how human beings ought to relate because, first of all, we're all different. Um, no two people who come together, or I guess maybe there's thruples out there who are listening, like, hey, what about us? No group of people who comes together to forge a relationship um, will will produce the same chemistry, right? Like there's a new chemical reaction that happens every time two or more people come together. That's novel and unpredictable, and um, I think we should be open about how we relate, which doesn't necessarily mean everyone should be in an open relationship, but I think these are things worth exploring, as terrifying as they might first appear to be, and as messy as they can sometimes become. Um, you know, it seems to me that even the default monogamous approach is messy. So we can't escape the messiness of relationship either way.
Yeah, that's probably what drives us into novel experiments, the sense that there should be a way to do this, that there's not so much friction. Um, I, and the notion of an open relationship is more evolved seems coherent if the ideal form are people who are in love with multiple people and receiving that same amount of love back. Um, and able to strike that balance. Anyone who could actually strike a balance there would be pulling off something almost superhuman. And so I'm curious when I know it wasn't your decision to go into it, but when you did go into it, was it sold to you as a possibility of loving multiple people deeply at once, or was it framed as you'll still be my main person, but I'm just able to get these other needs met elsewhere so I can show up in the way I want to for you?
Yeah, I think it's always been, in my experience, there was this sort of mostly spoken sense of, primary partner versus other partners who maybe have their own partners. And so, but maintaining a kind of balance is so important here because it can very easily become the case where, you know, one person has a primary partner and is relating to somebody else who doesn't have another primary partner and so can feel secondary, and that doesn't feel very good. And there are just basic limitations of space and time. Can't be in multiple places at the same time. Um, that all of that requires, negotiation, and it's not easy. And I don't know how people who have like multiple, like, three, four plus different partners, I don't really know how that works. I know that people do that, but it seems to me difficult. I mean, I can imagine having two people in my life that I love deeply and romantically, but I've never tried more than that. And I don't know if I have the capacity, but we can, I'm sure that I could stretch if I wanted to, but I haven't really had that issue come up. Um, it feels difficult to imagine uh, dividing my attention in that way. Um, but it's always been important for me for there to be mutual, not just mutual respect, but like real friendship and intimacy between everyone involved. And it doesn't necessarily mean like the same level of relationship among everyone involved, but um, some people like to do open relationships where their primary partner doesn't know and doesn't want to know anything about whoever else they're with, just to keep it separate. And that's always seemed kind of weird to me. Like, no, I want to know. Like, I want to be able to share. If I'm in love with somebody, I want to share your life and your joys and sorrows and everything, including your other relationships potentially, to at least share in, you know, being able to empathize with you in that. There's this term, maybe you've heard compersion, which is like the opposite of jealousy. It's when you actually feel joy when your partner feels joy in their other relationships.
I mean, that's more evolved if you're actually feeling
It's a real
undeniable.
emotion. I've felt it. It's
That's
also fleeting and hard to come by, but it's there. It's real. It can happen.
and so there were periods where during this time where under close examination, you wouldn't say there were subtle wars going on beneath the surface where you were competing with these other people and sort of wanting to hear that they'd fallen short. There were really extended moments where all the joy was equalized in its worthiness.
There are always competing emotions at play. But I can say honestly, there were times when, compersion was the dominant one.
Wow.
But just because I'm feeling that 75% doesn't mean there's a 25% like jealousy and fear and, you know, what if they decide to leave me for that person because of how much joy they're experiencing, so there's always that in the background that never just disappears entirely. But, that's just the nature of our emotional life. I think there's a cacophony um, of feelings, and sometimes some of them are amplified and others are turned down. But yeah, so I can't claim that I've ever had the 100% compersion experience. So I'm not that evolved.
Yeah, well, I would imagine you got about as close as any human being yet has gotten. Um, that's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, my earliest experience with jealousy was so intense. My first serious girlfriend in high school, I think I was a sophomore, who I uh I lost my virginity to her, but she had had sex with one other guy prior to me. And I was just tormented by that to no end. It really caught me by surprise. I would like stalk his social media and compare myself to him in all of these ways.
Did you
Uh,
find out after you two had slept together or something? Or
no, I knew beforehand. And it when I first found out, it was like, oh, cool, she has sex. And so this is gonna happen. Great. And then once we'd had sex, I was just overcome by like, okay, now I'm gonna marry you, you're mine. Like it was all the full like possession thing took over. And and so then the fact that she had shared that experience with someone else, it felt very emasculating to me. Um, where, I somehow wasn't her equal. Like like it was supposed to be that I was the more experienced one, and I simply wasn't. And then at one point, I mean, we were very immature. We exchanged Facebook passwords, and I ended up like going through all these like old messages between her and other guys. I mean, I really drove myself to the verge of insanity as a teenager. Um, and now I look back on that, and it obviously seems destructive and immature. And I think I sent her a pretty in-depth apology email, like 6 years ago or something, when I was just thinking back on things I'd said, and like I'm sure she doesn't care anymore, but I just don't like those hanging in the air. Uh, and now when you describe something like compersion, it's not impossible for me to imagine. Um, but it still feels like in order to get there, I'd have to let go of something that feels precious. Uh, where, where, yeah, to feel real joy that my partner is receiving romantic love from someone else, and not feeling like that is somehow costing me. That's, yeah, I think what I'm debating in my mind right now is whether I think that's something to work toward, um, whether that's a worthwhile area of evolution to focus on, or whether there's something healthy about a sense of, I guess, ownership and wanting to feel owned and exclusive. Um, because
Yeah, I asked these questions too. I mean, I mentioned there's something instinctual that would come up that does seem tied to the jealousy, the really powerful feelings of jealousy and emasculation, and um, there's anger mixed in there. And where is that coming from? Because if we do evolutionary psychology and trace it back, it's like actually monogamy is probably not that old. And the ideal of romantic love is definitely not that old. We're talking several hundred years, you know. Um, And so prior to that, marriage had a very different purpose. And not, maybe a few thousand years ago, marriage, you know, if we go back to, um, around the agricultural revolution and what life was like for hunter-gatherers before that, I don't think monogamy was it. There's much more of a tribal thing going on. And if you go far back enough, like men didn't even know the cause of pregnancy. It was like, well, no, the moon's doing that. It's not me that had sex with her that caused that child. It's just, children come
yeah.
and that they're part of the community. And so this evolutionary instinct to procreate doesn't seem to me to be the source of this jealousy that comes up in a contemporary context. Where does it come from then? I mean, is this just so deeply culturally um, imbued in us from childhood that we feel to be a man is to have a woman, you know? Um, and if we don't have that, then we're not a man. And if the woman's eyes stray from us or her heart strays from me, then I don't exist anymore. It's like this real sense of existential evaporation. Um,
And now
and
there's
so,
large areas of the toxic manosphere that are going all the way to a man needs to have many women that are all exclusive to him.
mhm,
And, there's a loose evolutionary logic
sure.
given for that as
There are
well.
many ways that this has been done in the past. Like there's no one way that human beings have related sexually. I think it's clear that there's lots we still need to learn and might never know about the past, but it does seem like there are a variety of relationship patterns that have existed for long stretches of time in different cultures, right? So there's no evolutionary reason to say, oh, polyamory is better or monogamy is better or whatever other. I mean, we're clearly a very experimental species. We've tried out a lot of things.
Yeah. Hmm. All right. Well, moving off of the relationship topic.
I feel like we're just getting started. All right.
Oh no, you know what? Yeah, no, I'm down to stay with it for a little longer.
Wherever you want to go.
Well, so again, now maybe this goes even more personal, but I feel like you occupy a really interesting, like pretty close to the center on the like sexuality spectrum. Like you really seem to be at like the center of the circle, to where it's like not at all strange for me to imagine you getting married to a woman, not at all strange for me to imagine it ending up a man. It all seems like it would fit very, it would all make sense. Um, I've had, yeah, well, and okay, I'll just get right to the question. Are gay relationships harder generally? Is there something more difficult about maintaining them over a long period of time? Do you feel like there's any sense where you're fighting nature in a way that you have to overcome? What's that like? Because you can compare the two experiences.
It's not any more difficult, at least in Northern California. If I were in Alabama or something, it'd probably be a little bit more difficult, uh, um, just culturally. But I mean, I have had at various times in my life that desire to have a family and to do it the old-fashioned way, and I'm not opposed to adoption, and maybe that'll happen one day. But there's just something about participating in the birth of a child and doing that has at different times been alluring to me. And at other times, I think maybe my my mission in this life, my karma in this life is not that, but it's to do something else that I wouldn't be able to do as much of if I were raising a family. Um, but there's something really special about adoption too that I've also at different times leaned into. One thing I probably would never do is that surrogacy thing. It's a little weird. Um, but because yeah, anyways, it's just a little
Real
weird.
quick on the surrogacy note, we have friends who went that route.
Mhm.
The surrogate mother ended up semi extorting them financially. You have all the leverage you could ever imagine. So she's just like, I'm feeling really stressed out. I'd like to,
Yeah.
I'm going to need this amount of money. And what are you going to do? She's carrying your child. So anyway,
Yeah, I mean, there's that aspect of it, which is weird, but and just the transactional nature of it. Like, I couldn't do it as a transaction. It would have to be a very special woman who was like, who I trusted and was also very close
trust,
with. And
trusted, like loved enough to trust with something like that, has your baby inside of her, but isn't the woman you want to be with. Yes.
I don't know if that exists.
Oh,
Um, yeah. So, yeah, is it more or less difficult? I mean, both are difficult for different reasons. Um, there is something more I'm gonna say more serious, but sex with a woman can lead to pregnancy. And so there's the sense in which there's a third being present potentially. And yeah, we have birth control, but um there's still there's the option we could make a baby right now, and that's just a different level of responsibility in a sense. And that creative power is just miraculous. I mean, I'm not claiming it, but a man has to be involved at some point. The creative power is really housed in the womb, though, obviously. And the burden of the work required to bake that baby is on the woman. Um, and so that's a different level of the context surrounding sexuality is, I think, heavier with women because of that. Um, but emotions are involved either way. People like to say, men are less emotionally wrapped up and can have sex recreationally without a problem. And I think that's probably more true, but it's not like men lack that emotional attachment that can occur when you've been sexual together. It's like it happens.
that's especially not gay men.
Right. Yeah. There.
I
Yeah.
mean, just in terms of like the when you think about the guy that can have sex and just not care at all, not get entangled at all, the image that comes to mind is a sort of like macho dude that's not really in touch with his emotions. And one of the more common characteristics that signals to you when you're talking to a man that maybe they're gay is like they're a little bit more in tune with their emotions. The feminine element isn't buried so deeply. And so yeah, I would just yeah, I know there's obviously more recreational sex in the gay community because you are dealing with the male libido with very few checks and balances. And I mean, there are huge signs all over West Hollywood, all just about the STDs that are spreading all over the area and how, I mean, that danger is very real. And, I know some people who've been in that scene for a period of time and very quickly, you can't go anywhere without seeing someone that's been with this other person. And on any given night, I mean, do you know who the comedian Gerard Carmichael is? Oh, well, anyway, he's a famous comedian that just put out a documentary just following his life. And he's gay and he is just showing how easy it is on any given night. He would like be scrolling through Grinder and have like three people show up in a given night, and it's just like it's a it's a wild lifestyle, at least how it's done here in Los Angeles. There are clubs I've heard about that you go to basement areas where you can, walk in a room and it's just agreed upon, like, okay, we'll have sex in this room. And then if I stay in this room, then the next person that comes in, I either have sex with them too, and I just stay in this room and keep having sex with different people, or I leave and they stay. Like these games, it's a wild thing. And there is something, I feel we've been in a cultural moment for a while where, because homosexuality was shunned for so long and people were punished unjustly for something very natural, there's hesitancy to look at any area of the culture of homosexuality and be like, but like I think we're that's not it right there. Like that more of that culture is not helping us or building us. And, you know, um yeah, what do you think about that? Just the way you see the dating culture in, I mean, I don't know if it's that different from straight, I've been married for a while now, but yeah, what's been your experience and your opinion on it from either a distance or close up?
I think because of the um, repression and oppression of gay people and the way in which the sort of religious motivation for some of that has been in effect, that a lot of gay culture now is a bit reactionary against any sense of sexual morality and just full on in the explorer what's pleasurable and um, just embrace hedonism, and you see that in the expressions of and pride parades, and there's something called the Folsom Street Fair here in San Francisco. I don't know if you know what that is. It's like a BDSM celebration on the streets. It's not a family event. Um, and it's yeah, it's I think compensation for the repression. And my hope would be that give it a decade or two and things will balance out a little bit more, or maybe not. I mean, our civilization seems to be uh, you know, uh, not going in a positive direction. So maybe things will just continue to spiral into pleasure as the primary um, driver of everything that we do in an increasingly consumerist society. But my hope would be that uh, the emphasis can shift a little bit more towards love and less towards just bodily gratification, because that gets old. These bodies get old. Uh, and what's left, companionship and being able to care about each other and have that emotional connection. And so it's not like I would want us to bring back the morality police and shame people for wanting to have sex, but it seems like a misplaced, like, what do we really want? We want to be close to each other. We don't just want to come again. I mean, that it's like, how many times can you do that before you just can't even feel anymore? So we want deep connection. And I think, um, that's ultimately that comes to the surface for people if you live long enough. Um, so I don't know. I don't so much feel the need to be critical of um, gay culture or straight culture and the way that sex gets commodified and becomes a kind of transaction, because ultimately I think that'll take care of itself in a way, either as individuals age or as the culture. I mean, gay culture to be open and to actually, have a place in a society where you don't have to hide. That's pretty new. And
Mhm.
so, of course, there are some kinks to work out. That's not the right word to choose,
Yeah, yeah,
but you know what I mean.
definitely.
We're learning.
Did you read the passage of Carl Jung? Maybe there were more than one, where he talked about homosexuality as some sort of distortion with the mother-son relationship. Uh,
Mhm. Yeah.
what were your thoughts on that?
Uh, yeah, I don't know, like the Oedipal complex gone wrong or something. I don't know. I think actually, in my experience, there are as many ways to be gay as there are to be straight. Like in terms of like what people are into and what's motivating it. And um, I mean, obviously, I don't think of um, homosexual attraction as necessarily pathological. I think there have been periods in history, including during Jung's day um, and in the birth of psychoanalysis, where there were a lot of men who, because of the social pressures and cultural expectations, who had these desires, thought something was wrong with them and wanted to be cured, and so they would go to psychotherapy, hoping there was some way to grow out of their attraction to men or to just process it in a way so that they wouldn't feel like they needed that. Whereas nowadays, there's if you're in a cultural context um, where there's some level of support and acceptance, then you don't feel like there's something wrong with you. You feel like, oh, I'm just different. Um, and so I think I don't fault Jung or I mean Stan Groff also writes about um, patients who came to him who were gay who wanted him to cure them with LSD psychotherapy, and he reports some success in that actually. And I don't fault him for that. These people came to him asking for help, you know, and this was like 1958 or something.
Hmm.
So, but nowadays I I think there's a different level of acceptance to where the experience of same-sex attraction doesn't need to be experienced as pathological, and isn't pathological. But at the same time, there's a level of, in the effort to create a kind of safe space and a culture of acceptance, I feel like it's the envelope has been pushed so far in the opposite direction now to where it's like when I hear about these polls of high school kids, it's really uncool to be straight now,
Yeah.
you know? And so everyone's identifying as queer, at least, if not bi or whatever, or trans. And um, I don't know that like, in order to, this happens often in culture, there are these reactions and things get flipped around, and you end up with an equally extreme opposite as to what you had before. And it's like, I don't think that, you know, non-straight people will ever be more than um 5% of the population. And that's okay. Like it doesn't need to be um like the opposite of normal isn't pathological. Like there can still be people who are different, who are the minority, and we can make space for them and accept them and be curious about it and interested and yeah, even to some degree like celebrate the differences without having to so center the 5% that everybody else feels like there's something wrong with them, or that like
And
being a cis man who's straight is like automatically makes you toxic or something.
as that percentage goes up, because at the very least it is in schools, are you
Mm.
seeing that as, okay, there's the real 5%, then these other people are faking? Or is it a percentage that can grow if encouraged? Like people just, that's available, they jump in, they like it, and now, it could suddenly be a much larger part of the population. And if that were to happen, would you think it has any connection on an unconscious level to some self-regulating population
Mm.
control, sort of where there's a sense that we don't need to be propagating as much anymore?
I mean, maybe there could be some room around the edges for like people who are actually more flexible and just never considered it and so didn't realize that they were. Um, and I have always, since I became a sexual being like in high school, like wished that more people were bi just because, more options for me. But uh, I I just haven't seen that play out like at least among like my generation, like millennials and stuff. Whatever's going on with the Zoomers and the even younger kids, I'm not sure. I don't know how long that will last. Is that a fad? Is that about a popularity
They're
thing in high
not
school?
actually having sex. That's the thing.
Right. Yeah.
They're, they're just
Right.
titling themselves and then
Yeah.
having
It's a box they check on Instagram or whatever. And that's, yeah, that's different. And how enduring that is, I mean, we'll see. I'm very curious to see if those numbers uh last in, as they get into their 20s and 30s. Like, how are you actually behaving? What kind of relationships have you actually been in? I think that'll be a different um set of data. But um yeah, I mean, I forgot what your question was.
Is that as that 5% grows? I mean, we kind of answered it in terms of, okay, so there are at least a sizable percentage
Yeah,
that are just saying it, but they're not actually acting on it. But there's also seems to be more, period.
yeah. I mean, I do think that there's um, evolutionarily speaking, that civilized human beings seem to be moving in the direction of greater androgyny, um, because we don't need as much of that sexual dimorphism to survive. And a lot of those hunter instincts are now maladaptive that men have had, right? And a lot of the, and women are learning to, and in many cases, in more progressive societies, being encouraged to step into their own agency, and um, that it's normal for women to be in charge of their own money and to own things. Like, that's pretty new. um, and so we're moving towards more androgyny, and what that means for sexual orientation, I'm not sure. But 100 years from now, if civilization doesn't totally collapse, I would expect more of this movement towards the center that, as you were describing me. And I don't know if that's my own bias and lens that I'm wearing, but it does seem like a larger cultural trend. And I know a lot of people in the manosphere and whatnot are terrified of this, but like, really, like, what's so terrifying about it? I mean, there's certain, I'm not, like, I get the desire, or let's say the fear that some men have, that, like, like the Boy Scouts can't even be called the Boy Scouts anymore. And it's like, is it okay to want to um instill certain values of masculinity in young boys, or is that automatically toxic? And some of those values, I think, are uh, positive, and we should want to keep around. But do we need to pigeonhole them and say, well, those are masculine values? That's how a man should be. I don't know about that either. But at the same time, growing up, I really was formed and loved competitive sports. And can that be co-ed? Maybe, but I played ice hockey, and it's not really fair for girls to play against boys. It's just not fair. Um, and so there were girls who played on the teams, and some of them were really good, but for the most part, it was dominated by boys. And there weren't enough girls for there to be a separate girls' league, right? In ice hockey in South Florida, at least. Um, and I wouldn't want to lose out on that experience. There's something positive about it, but I also recognize the ways in which it can be exclusive, and that doesn't feel good either. But so I don't know the answers to these questions, but I understand the fear, at least, that some men have about these cultural trends, even if I feel like they're inescapable and on the whole probably positive.
Yeah, positive, like you said, if civilization doesn't come, then there's not suddenly a call for that sexual dimorphism.
Right.
It's funny. A guy I train jujitsu with, I was just talking to another friend who knows him last night, and he's an incredibly caring person, very loyal, fiercely loyal. But the way he talks about violence and the way he recounts violent encounters of his youth, he gets off on it. It brings him so much joy to tell you about like how he knocked a guy's teeth out, or like how, he didn't care if he had to stick a thumb in your fucking eye socket, like that kind of stuff. And it's alarming because he's he's such a friendly guy in other contexts. But what I've realized is, to him, there's this intertwining between signaling fierce loyalty and showing that you have an appetite for violence. Because in all of these stories, partly what he's saying when he's talking about how he bashed that guy's face in is like, that's how much I care about my friends who these guys wanted to threaten. And like everybody knows you mess with my friend. And you can see there's this incredibly evolutionarily adaptive instinct in there that would be so needed in a hunter-gatherer context. You're going to need guys that are like, I love us. Anyone that's not us, I have no empathy for. And even if that means I occasionally hit the wrong person, all in all, this is going to serve us. And it's so obvious that those guys, they don't fit in the current culture, and they can feel their place disappearing. And it's so easy to justify it because, when you're hearing a guy talk about how much he loves hurting someone, you're like, well, certainly we don't want more of that. But like you said, yeah, if things stay relatively safe and keep tending toward that, we may not need those guys anymore. But if another country is continuing to breed that kind of personality, there will come a time where if they want to invade, we're we're going to be a bit mushier. I think in terms of the decline of traditional forms of masculinity, it's like the problems I see, they're not so much with how many gay kids there are or how many people want to be in gay relationships. It's really the men in straight relationships that are like losing a bit of their grasp of what it means to sort of be solid for their partner. And I have experience with this. You get sent very confusing messages because my wife is a thriving professional, right? And in her workplace, like she's a boss. And that that energy, I want to encourage it, right? Because it served her really well. And uh it's a source of great confidence for her, and I want her to feel that. But when I get confronted with that like boss woman energy, it's hard to know what to do with sometimes. It like brings a competitive energy out of me where I'm like, no, I can't let you have that role here. I mean, she makes way, way, way more money than I do, all these things. And I have an easier time with it now than I used to because just over time you find those dimensions of the relationship where you're less fearful, and you kind of find your masculinity and like, well, I'm not afraid to have this conversation, or I'll don't worry, I'll talk to him about it, or just ways that you still feel like you're defending the fort. But it can be confusing when in the music industry and entertainment generally, women are now more powerful than ever, and they're given, and not that they don't deserve them, but they're just in more and more of these powerful positions, and yet they don't want their man to be feminized to the same degree that they're occupying what they'd consider a traditionally masculine role. So yeah, as we move toward androgyny, and we look at how young people just aren't having sex also, that might be a piece of it where maybe part of human evolution, it's not so much about finding the perfect setup for us to all have incredible sex and feel like the fullest version of however we identify sexually. Maybe there could be a bit less of an emphasis on that interplay between masculine and feminine having to always happen between two people, and it is more something that we each reconcile within ourselves and then meet each other as wholes.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going to go with it. That, polarity is attractive. Um, and that can be in sexual polarity where, there's a male and female, but it could also be an internal polarity because like, you know, I love women who want to like wrestle, like who have that boss energy, and because then I feel like I can respond and meet them at that level and not feel like I'm gonna destroy. Um, because, the stereotypes are that like the feminine energy, the women are more delicate and you need to be careful and you don't want to raise your voice and because you might crush them or something. And so, but a woman who's like in there and wants to like battle and isn't just gonna let you make all the decisions. Like I love that. I like to wrestle with that energy. Um, and so I think that's just a function of me being more um kind of ambiguous in my own sexuality and in my um yeah, somewhat androgynous. Like I like being in that middle place and I like other people who are able to be um you know women who are more have more agency and men who are a little bit more willing to be relational like that's what I love, so but I think we're all unique in this respect, but to some degree I think yeah, as we move towards greater androgyny I think we're also internalizing that polarity so that like at different times we can take on different roles in relationship, right, rather than it always having to be I play this role and you play that role and we're fixed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, homophobia, um, in many contexts, it doesn't actually look like fear of homosexuality. It just looks like non-acceptance or disdain or like contempt or superiority or whatever. But um, where I grew up going to schools that, were more than half African American and spending a lot of time in friend groups that were almost exclusively African American. There sometimes there was like this ever it was almost a game, a constant game to like point out if someone had said something that could even be construed as gay a little bit, right? And any black person or anyone that spent any time knows exactly what I'm talking about, whether it's like no saying no homo or saying pause. And sometimes it's creative, like you're stunned that that person in point 0.5 seconds was able to figure out the creative flip of how what you just said. I'll be in the studio, with a rapper, right? And uh I'll be talking about like a vocal and I'll be like, oh man, you came in really smooth on that part. No, I'll be like, whoa, whoa, like that's crazy. Like came in smooth, like well, and I used to just be like, guys, do you not see how much more gay it is that you're always right there? Like that you're always uh and but that logic goes nowhere, at least with the people I've talked to. They're just like that, yeah, of course we're right there on some level. Like and there is, I wonder, and again, when I get to like theorizing about how different races interact with them, I'm sure I could go somewhere and say the wrong thing. But when we talk about how in more unforgiving survival based circumstances, the need for that sexual dimorphism is greater. And you wonder if that sense of like hyper masculinity that you obviously see a lot in hip hop, and then this fear that like there's this attitude toward homosexuality as if it could break through or something at any moment. Like there's this inner tension that's being held, and saying the wrong thing or relaxing your sense that you need to be like actively aiming toward the masculine at any time. It's like, whoa, I caught you lacking. Like you let that you didn't hold that tension and you almost opened those floodgates where like someone that considers themselves more sexually secure might be like, I'm not worried about the floodgate, I'm like that's over there and I'm over here and that's fine. And there is this sense that whatever valve gets opened, or whatever somebody that's like holding on to a set sense of their sexuality really hard, that when they let go, whatever it is that blasts through, it's more than just sexual. It like carries a bunch of other energy with it that feels threatening to like deadly to whatever ego is currently existing there. um
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, like as if gay is a disease you can catch if you aren't careful and don't wash your hands all the time. I mean, But I think,
That there's sorry there's that, and that's the sort of like, oh, that, it's such a messed up way they're thinking of this natural thing as a disease. But then there's the way of thinking about it where even if they're not conscious of this, it's not that gay is a disease you can catch. What they're almost implying is that it's a latent element of all of us that you have to be actively pressing down. They don't treat it as if that's the implication, but it feels like that's what's going on, where they're like, hey, like, get back on your job, like, you let it slip through. um and so even though they're not consciously maybe thinking that, like, oh, we all have these two elements that need to be reconciled, they're still acting it out in the form of, like, I've gone full masculine, and now
mhm,
there's this great tension that even the wrong suggestive wording when you're talking about something that has nothing to do with sex needs to be called out, because you'll open a hole in this wall. It's
mhm.
interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a theory that Freud, came up with, that we're born, in his terms, polymorphously perverse, which is to say we experience sexual pleasure across our entire bodies. It's not localized in a particular organ. And, as we age, like, women tend to have more of a dispersed sexual energy, whereas men, it gets focused on the dick. But if we're born more open and we're formed by parents, by culture, by various traumas and repressions, and end up with a particular sexuality as a result of all that armoring that we build up, then it would make sense what you're saying. And I don't totally, I think there's a lot to be said for this sort of Freudian approach, but talking to my gay friends and my straight friends, they don't like the idea that we're all born more or less, bi or pan or just open sexually. And I'm sure that there's a genetic and epigenetic component that's inherited. I'm sure. I mean, there's some evidence of that. But I also think, yeah, to a large degree, it's socialized. And this fear of, if we're not careful, we might slip up and stray from the straight path, I think is a function of that. Um, but it's also, I think there's a certain safety created for men to connect and have some degree of emotional intimacy with one another, as long as it's clear that this is not like no homo, like, so if you're constantly maintaining that line, then there's room to be a little bit more emotional in your connection with each other, maybe.
Yeah. And yeah, I'll even find myself. It's funny. So if I'm talking to a gay or bi friend, right? I I don't feel any discomfort. However, if I'm talking to a friend or an acquaintance who's holding their masculinity very tightly, the discomfort I feel is actually this sort of like, there's some repressed sexual thing here that it's like the way it the way you'd expect, a traditionally straight guy with not that much exposure to gay guys to feel uncomfortable talking to a gay guy. That's how I'll feel when a really masculine guy's like getting too close to me. It feels like there's more of like a sexual thing that could jump out at any moment than with somebody where it's like it's in there. It's not back there. It doesn't have like an animalistic, unconscious readiness to express itself. Um, yeah, it's an interesting thing. Do you, I'm sure a fair amount of trans. I'm sure you have trans students and maybe have trans friends. Uh, my feeling in regard to the growing number of young people who identify as transsexual, and sort of frame that greater acceptance, that there's a greater acceptance of that sort of person that we need to make room for in society. I felt like the thing that's being neglected, the idea being neglected there, is just that there's such thing as a person who is male physically and feels like feels identifies with their feminine side, or like feels like a girl. It just is who they are. Like that we don't they don't become suddenly more real or actual if we're addressing them in another way. And that the person that seems to be clinging to traditional notions of sexual roles is the person that's saying, wait a minute, I have a penis and yet I feel very feminine. Well, that must mean I'm really a woman, because only a woman could feel feminine, and it makes no sense for someone who's a man to feel this way. And so you need to address me. That's the person who's stuck on men are this way, women are this way, right? And I just don't feel, I feel like that gets lost in the conversation a bit.
I mean, this is a very complicated issue, and I have like tremendous compassion for people that have to struggle with transitioning. And I see a lot of, in many cases, trans women who are reproducing horrible stereotypes about what it is to be a woman, and vice versa. Um, more often though, it's the trans women reproducing really unfortunate stereotypes about women. And this is a very delicate moment culturally, and I think we're going to get things wrong. And, um, I- you know, I've been paying reasonably close attention to all of the drama, um, around whether it's the pronouns or the bathrooms, or sports. And, I think most people who are compassionate and reasonable pretty much get it right, which is like, let's pay close attention to the individual circumstances here and like not make, there's a brilliant thing that Republicans have done, which is make an issue that is so delicate, and with each situation being unique, each person being unique, each family being unique, and blowing it up into this national controversy where you're either for it or against it. And it's like, well, for what and against what exactly? Brilliant strategically for the Republicans to do this, because it just dramatically oversimplifies an issue that can't be talked about in a black or white way. Just can't. Um, and so, you know, I think you're basically right. I think, if we're gonna do this trans thing, we have to be a little bit more flexible and let go of these essential gender stereotypes instead of further reifying them in an effort to be who we think we truly are. I mean, each of us is unique. We don't need to fit into some binary category to know who we truly are, And so, but it's a tremendous moment of growth for, I think, human beings, that comes with the good and the bad and comes with a lot of confusion. And I think we'll work our way through it. I mean, it's biologists talk about major evolutionary transitions, like, when the first eukaryotic cell was forged, and when the first multicellular animal emerged, and like, human beings are a geological force now. We're in the Anthropocene. And so on some level, what happens with our species is going to affect the entire planet and population growth and everything like that. And so I would say what we're going through in, mostly modern Western societies with this transgender thing and with the growing acceptance of gay and lesbian people, I think it's a major evolutionary transition. And, that doesn't, I don't, that doesn't necessarily need to have a teleological thing like, oh, yes, this is better. It's just what's happening. And things are going to look a lot different, and it's going to be messy for a while. Um, and I would just hope that, politically, I think liberal societies should be better at this because we value individuality, and we should make room for the uniqueness and the free expression of individuals, and move away from, I mean, there's this one issue of abortion. I mean, there are probably other issues too, but like, men and women still have that difference that like no man ever, at least biological man, is ever going to need an abortion. And so that puts women in this more vulnerable position. And so we can't just treat everyone like an individual and forget that, women also, like, new people come out of women. Um, so that's one thing. But technologically, what 50, were we 50 years away from people being born in plastic wombs? I don't know. I don't know that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's coming. And so we're just moving in this direction of greater androgyny. And I think it affords more individual freedom, which in the long run is a good thing. Um, and I just hope we can not lose the plot here, and get hung up on trying to maintain a reified conception of what we think gender roles are supposed to be, because in the long scheme of evolutionary history and even human history, like these things have never been fixed.
Do you think if you didn't watch any news that you'd have any idea that there's even an issue with how people feel about one another's sexuality? Like, do you encounter it in the world, or does it pretty much seem like you get online and you're given this narrative that we're at war, and then you
Mhm.
talk to people and they're more or less accepting?
I mean, I've done a little traveling like through the middle of the country, and I've had dinner table conversations with acquaintances who are more conservative, and more often than not, we arrive at some reasonable mutual understanding. Um, and so, yeah, the media plays into creating a sense of the polemic. Um, but it's a feedback loop, right? So sometimes there are ways in which that bleeds into the classroom, or you encounter it on the street or something. But yeah, the media's influence in amplifying the divisions is certainly a big part of the problem.
Yeah.
Because when
Yeah.
we meet each other outside the media context, where the media is always dealing in generalizations, right? Because it's trying to appeal to a mass audience. But when you meet other individuals and you're the slightest bit, um, open-hearted and receptive to this new person you're just meeting, it's much more difficult, I think, to not see the common humanity and not recognize that you have something in common still, and that you can meet on that basis. And even if you don't understand that person's identity or whatever, you can at least acknowledge and come to discover that they're not trying to eradicate you or prevent you from being you. And so live and let live. Whereas the media makes it seem like this is a war of each against all.
Yeah, and I think the way people speak in echo chambers, whether it's online or just among friends who all have the way a few straight guys might be showing off how masculine they are by speaking negatively about gay people, and the way I don't some black people might talk about white people, and there's a tendency to think, well, that's how they really feel, right? Like behind closed doors. And then they're just putting on this front in front of people that actually are that other thing. But I don't know if that's true. I think the most true expression of how a human being regards another human being is how they regard them in an actual encounter in the world. And that what's going on when, say, a bunch of straight guys are talking about gay guys, or black people are talking about white people, or vice versa. what what they're not talking about any individuals, like the phrase gay people or white people in that circumstance is really just a placeholder for a way of like talking about a certain trait, um that and yeah, and sort of like signaling loyalty in some way to these people that I'm around right now. And it gets misconstrued because then if you read those if it's in the form of text on the internet, things that were normally just said behind closed doors, you might think, oh, like the truth is coming to light. There's all this dormant homophobia and dormant racism. And there is, in a sense, where I think whenever a group of people have something in common with each other, one enjoyable thing to do in that context is to talk about the kind of person that we don't have here and sort of all give our opinion on them. Um, but I I don't know if that's necessarily so unhealthy event if then we're not. seeing those, if those people aren't seeing those conversations and reading, I think ultimately it's just about how do we show up in the world, and like the most we can hope for is to coexist in common spaces and be able to recognize one another's common humanity in real life. Yeah.
Yeah,
um
and we don't all need to like each other,
yeah.
you
No.
know, and like I think there's this really soppy like multicultural ideal that sometimes gets pushed that to me is unrealistic and silly almost because like these unique differences, individual but also cultural group differences, like they're really valuable, and it's not wrong to feel that in-group cohesion,
Mhm.
right? And it always does come with a little bit of at least a kind of joking about those who are not part of the in-group.
It has to, like, if you're say you're with a group of guys in like on a football team, right? Which is like the stereotypical context where, again, your way of signaling in this context that you're like one of you care about what we're trying to do here is like you're not like you get hit in a way that looks like it hurts, but instead of making it all about you in that moment and complaining, you suck it up, right?
Mhm.
And the idea, like in that you do want to applaud that, and right, it's gonna come with uh making fun of the opposite, right? If somebody like starts crying, and then you think, okay, stereotypically, who are the guys that are like more ready to express deeper emotions, right? It's a crazy oversimplification, but we're looking for something we can say in 2 seconds, and I'll call you that. And if someone in that context is like, well, wait a second, like there are plenty of gay men who, are just as capable, it's like you're missing the point. We're not actually doing social commentary here. We have these shorthand terms, and we're trying to encourage a sort of behavior that we do need here. Um, yeah, I think I mean, I say we don't want to lose that. I don't think we won't lose that. I don't think we will, even if we wanted to. I think that's just kind of here, and if and yeah, there a greater emphasis on uh, just understanding that people say all kinds of things that uh, have their place, even if that place is not, to be said on a megaphone as the new policy of how we should all think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my ethos for this would be like be curious about other people and their differences. You should be curious, but you don't need to celebrate everybody else's difference. Like we celebrate what we love, and that's fine. We should be curious and like have that live and let live attitude, I think, and not attack, and certainly not, try to eliminate or push out of society people who are, loving a different way or um have a different cultural way of being in the world. But this idea that we could somehow all like love each other's differences, I think is a bit naive. Like that's just not possible. Like we can have a deeper transpersonal love of the individual souls who are behind whatever the cultural trappings are or the sexual desires are or whatever it might be. But that's a matter of real that requires some spiritual and moral development, in all of us to be able to tap into that level of mutual recognition of someone else's humanity. But at, a slightly more superficial level, like I'm, never gonna like all kinds of music. I have my particular tastes, and that's okay, right? So I don't know. I don't know if what I'm saying even really makes sense or is landing, but I just feel like there's something a little bit too, there's something naive about this multicultural ideal that we could all just be a mixing pot. And it's like, no, we're gonna have differences, and that's okay, even to celebrate those differences. And maybe comedy is an equalizer here. Like we can make fun of each other. There's nothing more that makes me feel like better about this particularly, American social experiment in democracy is to hear a good comedian. Usually they're a person of color who's making fun not just of white people, but of everybody. And it's just and to see an audience, a mixed audience, like just laughing hysterically. Like that's there's something in that that allows us to connect with that common humanity while still maintaining our differences. And
Watched Kill
I just love
Tony.
it. Who is it?
Kill Tony. Are you familiar with that show?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so Austin, Texas has become the mecca of comedy now. LA's comedy scene is deader than dead. It's really depressing. You go to the places that used to be, the Comedy Store and the Laugh Factory, and at least as of a couple years ago, it had gotten so PC that it was really hard to stomach. And Kill Tony, it's this guy Tony Hinchcliffe. Um, he's straight, but he's constantly made fun of for being gay. He sounds so gay, and he makes fun of himself for that. And he's a roast comedian. He just got very famous because he was on the roast of Tom Brady. But on the show Kill Tony, the format is that he's sitting at a table and he'll have a panel of a couple of other comedians, and they'll have a few regulars come up and perform, but then they'll pull names out of a bucket. And people that have signed up do a minute of stand-up comedy for millions of people online and in this club. And if they do really well, it can, launch a career for them. And if they don't do well, they get torn apart by professional comedians. And the humor, like it's all racism and homophobia, all of it. Like there's these legendary roast battles between this big fat black comedian David Lucas and Tony Hinchcliffe, and it's all just Tony calling him saying black stereotypes and fat stereotypes, and David Lucas ripping Tony apart, talking about how he wants to shove everything up his ass, and it's so it's so cathartic. It's understood on that show that we're gonna like what if you're fat, we're going at that. If you're ugly, we're going at that. There's just and it can get so mean because if somebody's not ready to go to that in a way transpersonal place where it's like you can pick apart this avatar as much as you want and I'll laugh because ultimately we all just showed up as this thing and there's something funny about like we're just all these weird different shapes and there's something silly about every kind of person when taken to the extreme. But and if somebody doesn't break, if they're too they will roast them to the point where it's hard to watch. You will watch people like have the worst experience of their life, but then there's something so triumphant about when you see people saying the meanest things they could ever say, and everyone's enjoying it and everyone's laughing. And it does feel like whatever this energy is, it wasn't there even 5 years ago. I mean, this show's been around, but it's just really risen to popularity and is now like the center of the comedy sphere. And it, there's a lot of signs of degeneration in our society, but comedy looked like in 2018 or so, it looked like by now comedy would practically be non-existent. People were getting canceled left and right. And right now whatever's happening in that scene, it speaks well of like a sort of a new way to approach. It's like the kind of humor that we didn't know if it would survive the internet. There's now so much of it on the internet and it's proliferating so quickly you can't cancel everyone fast enough, and so it's sort of getting back to this point where we can joke about each other, which I think is wonderful. But speaking of ways that society's changing rapidly. I remember, in one of our conversations a month or so ago, I had seen some of the new AI technologies and it was freaking me out. And you were saying, you try not to be too pessimistic about it and you actually have quite a bit of excitement about it. And I had an experience last week at a writing camp, which like, a label will get a few rooms of writers together to like work on a particular artist project. And it was this like Japanese artist, and there were all these producers in there that were using the new AI music tools, which had uh, really sent a wave of fear through the whole industry because yeah, you can just type in prompts and get these like well mixed, well produced versions of whatever you ask it for musically. But what I was seeing these guys do, they were just typing in prompts pretty rapidly, and then they would like listen to what the AI did, and then they'd like find 3 seconds of it. They're like, ooh, that's really cool. And they'd cut out that 3 seconds of it, like drag it into the session and make that part repeat, and then think of something that would go nicely with it. And you're just watching them like mine this mind for quick ideas that then their taste level is still responsible for getting the best result out of. And people are all doing this in different rooms, and it just looks like a new version of the same process in a lot of ways. And, as we were all gathered around the computer in awe of how quickly this computer could generate, something we typed in, I was imagining how strange it must have been for people that were used to musical sounds only coming out of instruments to have gathered around a computer for the first time and just heard like that you could generate a trumpet sound without a trumpet being played, and how earth-shattering that must have been. And I know that we're in a demonstrably new place with the AI stuff because uh it now, like, I think in the past developments in technology expedited that process from the beginning to the result, and we're in this period right now where you instantaneously can get what constituted a finished result even a year ago. But in response to that, we're seeing that what constitutes a finished result evolve, because people are still competing. And this notion that we all thought that AI would, take the working class jobs first, and that the spheres of writing and creativity would be last. And oh my gosh, it hit those first. I'm starting to think that might be a bit of an illusion, because the very nature of these creative types is that whatever they're given, they begin competing with each other and trying to use these tools better than each other. And there was just this moment where this machine could generate something that looked like the finished product they'd been making. But now, even a couple months in, I'm just watching it get integrated. And all the negative, scary things that are going to come about, all the job loss and the many people that won't be able to keep up and compete, that's all still true. But it was a nice moment of optimism. And I'm wondering if you've had any of those experiences, seeing AI be used in a way that feels promising.
Yeah, I mean, technology has always been disrupting the economy back to fire, like and that's not to say that there aren't better and worse ways of introducing a new technology that's particularly I mean the AI is an extractive technology, which is to say, whether it's music or images or text, we're training it on stuff that other human beings have produced in the past. And so it's feeding us back to ourselves, and then we're assessing that and further refining it. And so in some sense, it's all us with this little bit of digital filtering and statistical analysis going on in between. Um, and yeah, it's disruptive. And my one fear is that in the efforts to mass market these technologies, where the claim from the companies is that this is artificial intelligence, but what's really happening is that our um, the actual world and our human interactions are increasingly being shaped by the limitations of these technologies. So in other words, we're redesigning our world so that these seemingly intelligent machines make fewer mistakes. So we're simplifying the world, we're simplifying human interaction, and so what happens to art when this process progresses? I'm not sure. I mean, what you're describing is a positive sign. Like human creativity is alive and well in the interface with these technologies. And in my own work, like I love the fact that I can record a video like this and get a transcript in 5 minutes that's really good, and then work with that to write up um, an essay that's more or less what was said in the video. But to have that so quickly available has been a game changer for my workflow, and it's allowed me to be it's supported another level of creativity for me. Um, Now, if I were a high school teacher, I would pretty much I wouldn't be able to assign take home essays, because too many students in high school just want to get the grade and are going to use these tools to write an essay for them. But as a teacher at the graduate level, I have encountered a little bit of that, but not, we're talking like 1 in 100. And because, at graduate school, um, you probably are there because you want to learn something, not just because you want, at least in philosophy, not just because you want a grade, because the degree is not going to get you a job. I'm sorry. um, so I'm less worried about it academically. But on the other hand, uh, with the printing press, it gave more people access to literacy, which is a really important skill, not just because you can read the news, but because it actually helps to cultivate in you a sense of interiority and a sense of individuality and an inner train of thought that if you don't read, you don't actually have. And like we don't realize this, but for oral cultures, like the whole phenomenology of consciousness and the inner life was different. Once you learn to read, even if you don't read much at all, the inner landscape of your consciousness and attention has been transformed. You are a new kind of self because you became literate. And now, we've already had radio, TV, the internet, and now that we have these large language models, I do wonder how these new media technologies are going to transform consciousness in new and different ways. Um, Plato was really worried that literacy was going to wreck people's memories.
Mm.
And to some extent, yeah, what used to count as memory in ancient Greece, where you could recall all of Homer, all of the Iliad or something. Yeah, I can't do that. I mean, most people can't do that. Well, it's written in the book. Why do I need to, I could just read it, free up my mind to worry about other things. But what the consequences of these technologies will be, I don't know, but I'm sure there will be positive and negative things, just like there has been with every other media technology that's come online. So my only concern though is, yeah, that we give up so much of the complexity of our human world in an effort to make the machines more efficient, because there is a economic driver that would want to push us in that direction. Um, and we need to resist that, um, because there are better and worse ways for these tools to be integrated into our lives and into our economy.
Mhm. Yeah, I just saw a YouTube ad that wasn't even, I was just on YouTube generically, not even on my account. So I guess it could pop up for anyone. And you had to look closely to be able to tell that the woman that was speaking was not real. She looked completely real, like an attractive young woman talking about how she'd recently started a love affair with a much older man, who, she was expecting to not have the sexual vitality she needed, but he showed her the night of her life, and then she found out that he was on these specific pills, and it, and I I was just like, wow, this here we go, because this I'm having a tough time. I had to look really closely to realize this wasn't a real girl. And normally, you'd kind of be able to tell the legitimacy of a product by like how it's being marketed, who they were able to get. If a company's able to get an A-list actor to advocate for them, it still might be a scam, but probably of a higher order. Not something, you're gonna take the pill and like, not be able to shit for a month. And it it's the senior citizens right now that they're gonna be, yeah, I mean, it was no coincidence that this was about medication for an elderly man who's lost his vitality. And you're sort of seeing it. I also saw a trailer for a movie coming out. I think it's called Thelma, about, this old woman she's tired of being scammed. someone calls pretending an AI calls, or one of these call centers in India, and pretends to be her grandson, and gets her to wire all this money, and then she becomes John Wick and goes on a mission with machine guns to take this sort of like revenge, because this is such a common occurrence right now. And that's one element that is going to be quite sad to behold. Speaking of which, the have have you ever seen those videos where someone will hack one of those call centers in India where they're doing a lot of these and they'll let the person on the phone know that they know what shirt they're wearing, and they know their name. There are it from the footage I've seen inside these call centers in India, where it's just scams all day long. They look like normal business establishments. There's like an HR woman, and you'll watch, because there's these videos where they've hacked the cameras, and you'll watch the way these people interact with each other, and they're very polite, and they seem like nice, normal people that have just normalized. And maybe because their myth of America is that like it's all a bunch of multimillionaires who and we need it more than they do. um, but it's kind of shocking because you would just expect to see a little bit more of a callous demeanor on people whose day-to-day job is to lie and steal, but you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how they justify that, but there could be a bit of like, you know, this former British colony, the United States, like they kind of um were owed a little bit here, reparations or something. I don't know. I don't know how they're justifying it, but
No, I mean, yeah, of course not. Just yeah, how are they
but
doing that? Go to dive. No. Um, Yeah, well, so to get back to the wave of AI ads that right now are at least of the sophistication level to be able to fool, someone who maybe their cognitive capacities deteriorating a bit. We're almost to the point where any speech you're seeing given by a politician, any song you're hearing. I mean, I don't know if you were following the Kendrick and Drake rap beef, but in between them dropping their songs, there were all kinds of AI versions coming out that we all had to question whether they were real or not. Um, and my sister is a therapist, and she uh was saying that she's encountering more and more high school students who are opting out of social media altogether. And I remember hearing Brett Weinstein say that one of the scariest things that he had expected there to be a mass exodus from social media, like a youth movement where you'd at least see that something like the hippie equivalent, that we're like, we can't tell what's real anymore, that we've seen all the documentaries about how this is gaming our dopamine and rage baiting us, we're done. And that he wasn't seeing that at all, and it's still not a mass movement. um do you think we'll see a big moment like that at some point, or do you think the stuff's so powerful and so intertwined in our lives that it'll just be, unique individuals here and there trying their best to opt out?
um yeah, I've read a little bit about the youth revolt and like at least a semi-strong movement to not have camera phones and go back to like the old, I mean, for them, the old digital cameras. Um, and I think that's encouraging. And the social media doesn't seem like it has staying power, at least in its current form. There's just too much evidence that it's destroying young people's lives, and that I mean, the politics of Facebook for like my parents' generation is it's a dark, dark scene. Um, and you know, China regulates the consumption of social media very tightly, especially among young people, for a good reason. And I'm not, excited about a overly authoritarian state coming in and micromanaging everything, but it's it's on a level of like cigarettes and lung cancer and stuff. It's a real risk to people's health, and it's highly addictive. And um, whether it's the youth revolting or stronger regulation, I just feel like we're at the end of the age of social media. And that doesn't mean the internet and personal expression online is going to disappear, but I think it's going to take different forms. Um, I don't yeah, I don't want to plug particular websites, but there are forums out there that allow for a kind of artistic expression, or like as a writer, being able to get my ideas out there that function less like some other of the major social media networks do, and really foster a spirit of collaboration. And what's great about the internet, I mean, the kind of crowdsourcing and hive mind you can get on like Reddit, I think is invaluable. And so there are dimensions of this collective intelligence that can emerge online that are not just super awesome, and I hope don't go away. Um, and maybe the solution is just breaking down these monopolies and having more diverse social networks, in the sense that like there's not one platform that everybody is supposed to be on. And we're already kind of moving in that direction. Um, but then it just affords there's less opportunity for like total capture of the entire audience of the internet by one viral meme, because everybody's sort of at different places in the network, and there can be counteracting effects, and just more opportunity for an emergent collective intelligence that's not driven by a single corporation's algorithm. Um, but yeah, it's a hopeful sign that young people are doing that, and I don't have any clear image of what the internet's going to look like in 10 years. Like, is VR going to take off, or AR? I'm not sure. Like, um, but it's going to look very different. That's all I know for sure. I think it's going to look very different in 10 years, and probably surprising.
In under the recent video that you put up, at one point in the video, you mentioned that you're reading occult science right now. And I saw that someone had commented asking questions about, the validity of what Steiner was saying in it. And you said that you don't read a book like that by Steiner, judging the things he's saying as either true or false. You're more interested in the experiment he's undertaking and its potential to help us, I think you said, imaginatively recollect the past. This might be um, not a compatible connection, but I'm wondering, I would love for you to go a little more deeply into what you mean by imaginatively recollect the past, and if you can imagine a way that technology could be helpful for that, or if it's another sort of thing entirely.
Yeah, so what Steiner's trying to do in this book, which is for most people, and even for me a lot of the time, it's completely wacky, just because it strays so far from what we're usually told a human being is capable of knowing. And yet, we have this in the modern world, we have this secular creation myth called the Big Bang, and it's a story of the evolution of the universe from a singularity, some kind of quantum fluctuation, to atoms and stars and galaxies and Earth, life emerges, and eventually, you know, complex animals and human beings with intelligence capable of doing the science to recollect this whole thing. And we're enculturated to think that that's, not a creation myth, but a scientific theory. And there's a difference between myth and theory, but they bleed together. And I think once you've recognized the inextricable entanglement between human consciousness and the knowledge that that consciousness can produce um, about the universe. In other words, like all of our knowledge is perspectival. Like science is a cultural activity, and it's fully immersed in um, human psychology, political economy, and all of these things that bias it in various ways. Um, like you could see this when you look at the differences between like Soviet science and biology in particular versus Anglo-American biology through the 20th century. It's like, is it any surprise that Anglo-American biology emphasized individual competition, whereas Soviet biology emphasized symbiosis and cooperation? We see different things because of, how our culture constitutes us, even when we're doing science. And so, I look at the Big Bang Theory and see how it basically leaves out consciousness. Consciousness is only something that accidentally emerges on the periphery um, at the very end of this evolutionary process that we're describing. And yet, at the same time, for it to make any sense, we have to imagine ourselves as conscious beings back there at the beginning watching it happen. And we're describing the conglomeration of matter and energy and stuff through billions of years as if we were there watching. We're just floating out there in space, taking it in. And, you might say, well, yeah, but, none of our descriptions depend on the fact that there was actually someone observing it back then. But like, let's be epistemologically careful here and really try to understand what we could possibly mean by the descriptions we're giving if there weren't a disembodied I watching this all happen back then. And so what Steiner is doing is saying, okay, we can't escape this. We're always going to be imagining ourselves having been there, witnessing this creation occur. And so let's take that seriously. And let's not imagine that consciousness just emerges accidentally on the periphery at the end of this process, but that consciousness was what was growing and developing all along the way. And whether or not the details of what he describes are accurate. Like that's why I say I'm not really so much concerned with is this true or is this false. I'm kind of holding that judgment in suspense and trying to understand the methodology here and trying to see if there might not be ways in which at the deepest layers of our embodied experience that there might be a kind of phenomenology we could cultivate to surface that in us, which is very old, and like the presence of these earlier stages of evolution that are still in us and accessible experientially, and that goes against the standard scientific method because standard science in its pursuit of objectivity wants to get rid of experience and get rid of feeling and get rid of everything considered to be subjective. Whereas Steiner is saying, no, 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 the subject and object have always been wed. Can't have one without the other. So let's do science and let's do natural history as if that were the case and see how it looks, right? And it looks quite different, which is why the story he tells in Occult Science is so wacky. Um, but at the same time, I think it's more, um, at least the general approach is more convincing to me than the Big Bang approach, which starts with just dead matter and all of a sudden we pop out
So
at the far end.
what's the approach? What is the methodology? Because
Mm.
I'm totally with you, but then he's saying a lot of specific things that yeah transcend the notion that there simply was consciousness the whole time.
Mhm.
Where, yeah, what is the method by which he's drawing this particular picture?
Well, it's a method that requires spiritual exercises to cultivate different modes of consciousness um, that would be different from our normal waking consciousness. And there are techniques going back to the Vedas in ancient India for developing cities and these different spiritual powers and organs of perception. And so Steiner offers these exercises which are quite simple, like there's the nightly review exercise where every night before you fall asleep, you're laying in bed and you recollect the events of your day in reverse from the moment just before you laid in bed to when you woke up. And the idea is if you do this every night, for a while, you begin to strengthen a certain organ of your soul that can support a kind of cognition and awareness that, eventually the idea here is that when you go to sleep at night without doing this practice, you're unconsciously doing a kind of daily review. Um, and a lot of your dreams come out of that. And to make that process conscious, it's again strengthening like this spiritual muscle, if you want, so that you begin to go into sleep and stay conscious. You actually stay awake, even though your body is asleep, you stay awake. And this is, in Steiner's view, a kind of preparation for dying, where I don't know if you're familiar with the near death experience literature, but it's striking how many people report this life review experience, right? Um, and doing this every night is preparation for what's going to happen when you die. And it's an attempt to develop a kind of consciousness where normally when we fall asleep, we go into unconsciousness. And if we can cultivate a stronger sense of wakefulness, Steiner's idea is that these earlier layers of evolutionary development will become transparent to us because everything gets like fractally or holographically recapitulated. So like the daily nightly cycle of the 24-hour cycle of human life in some way recapitulates the entire history of the universe, right? And so if we can stay conscious um through the dreaming, like lucidly dream, and through the deep sleep state, we're still awake despite being asleep. Steiner says that it's there that we begin to gather uh, the visions, the insights, the feelings that um, carry forward these events which occurred in the past, in the evolutionary past. And so yeah, it's weird, right? I hope I've conveyed some of
No,
uh, the
it,
logic here, but
yeah, no, I think I'm following the logic. I, so when we've talked about Whitehead and his notion of, the primal form of experience being emotional, and that the closest we can get in our current form of consciousness to that that primal immediacy of early organisms be something like the feeling of I'm cold, I want, I move, just these very simple feelings. And this could be incorrect, but the picture I'd begun to extract from Whitehead was that the the evolution of the organism, and the expansion, and complexification of how it's apprehending its environment is one with the development of that environment. And so, but it sounds like what Steiner's doing is he's trying to bring the current state of human consciousness and project it back to that and say, well, here's what was really going on in the bigger, in the larger environment when we were just these little organisms. Um, and I mean, maybe both are valid imaginative approaches, but it seems like Steiner's view privileges where we are now. And where it was like, we say we continue to develop, we'll eventually be using a totally different sort of consciousness and a totally different scope of understanding to project back into now what was really going on. Whereas Whitehead is like, no, what was really, like, there wasn't, what was really going on when we were smaller was smaller. Like there wasn't. Am I misunderstanding him?
I think there's more compatibility between Whitehead and Steiner here, and that Steiner's not so much projecting back how we are now into the past, but trying to point out that how we are now is a result of the accumulation of these layers of evolutionary achievement. And so, you mentioned like these feelings of warmth and cold, right? That's actually one of the things Steiner points to as one of the earliest phases of evolution that can be recollected has to do with it's more of when the organism and the environment were inseparable. Like the organism hadn't separated yet from the environment, and all that there was, Steiner describes as just warmth. There was just this amorphous, undifferentiated cloud of warmth, and it gradually condenses, and then all of a sudden there's room for light, right? And then there's a continual process of condensation, and eventually you get very subtle forms of matter, and you get um, only relatively recently do you get actual mineral substance out of which like the earth is made, and that geologists think has been around for billions of years. Steiner's saying that earlier in the evolution of the earth, it was actually less material. And one of the weird flips that happens in Steiner's view of evolution is that what we think of as dead matter actually is a byproduct of life. So like life comes before matter, whereas in the standard materialistic picture of evolution, life comes out of matter. But Steiner's point, which is I think quite convergent with the kind of Gaia theory, is that the very geology of the planet is a function of the work that living organisms have been doing for billions of years. I mean, primarily bacteria, to drive everything from tectonic plates to the regulation of the atmosphere. And so it's like everything, at least, in the crust of the earth and up into the upper atmosphere, because organisms seed clouds too, right? That this biospheric layer, at least, which includes a lot of the geology of the planet, is driven by life, right? And so, Steiner is not saying that our kind of self-reflective, individualized consciousness goes all the way back to the beginning, but he is saying that the process of evolution has been about the the flowering of the eye, the flowering of consciousness from the beginning, and that's not something that just accidentally happened to pop out the end. Um, it's actually what the whole thing is about. And so if you center consciousness in that way, it doesn't mean centering um, our really, refined, scientific, individualized form of consciousness. It means you're centering an awareness which is striving to become more, and that evolution is really about that striving. And I think it's a panpsychist vision, and so it's very much compatible um, with what Whitehead is doing. And there's a much longer case to be made for that, but I actually do feel like that might be my next major writing project, like for a book, is to show how Whitehead's cosmology and Steiner's esoteric vision can lend some support to one another.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Although so when I was saying Steiner's projecting back our current form of consciousness, I wasn't meaning to say that he thought there was something like our current consciousness at the beginning. Um, I guess what I'm trying, and yeah, I think he even was the one that yeah, the hot cold thing I said, I think it actually came from Steiner and not Whitehead. But would I be correct in saying that Whitehead's notion, I know of course Whitehead believes ultimately it's about the flowering of awareness as well, and that um we should be understanding these past processes in terms of what they yield rather than vice versa. Uh but in when consciousness was at the most simplified form that, let's say, we can imagine, does Whitehead imagine that that there was a small, like a limited, purely feeling, primal, instinctual center of consciousness in an environment that we could now better understand given how we're able to perceive the environment now, like it was going on in an external world that we just couldn't see yet? Or it is the external world, and its growth, is that the same thing as the development of that consciousness? And so when I'm saying Steiner seems to project back, it's just that, like, I and again, I'm just using these names as a dichotomy that's probably not even between them, but is yeah, what was Whitehead's view on the existence of a more complex external environment when consciousness was not capable of perceiving it?
I think for both of them, for Whitehead and Steiner, the organism environment should be understood as a hyphenated unity, like organism hyphen environment. They've always been inseparable. And but throughout the course of evolution, organisms have become more differentiated from their environments. But the environment, quote unquote, is always other organisms in a network of relationship to our organism. And ultimately, I think both of them would be amenable to the idea that there is one or cosmic organism. My a colleague of mine, a process thinker, Derek Malone France, calls it theorganism, just THE organism, like theo. I mean, it's the divine organism, which is itself a kind of plurisingularity, to use Catherine Keller's term. It's unified but also open, and so constantly growing and proliferating. But um, we're also like the cells within the body of this divine being. And so God is both environment for us, and God is inside of us, because each of us as organisms is a recapitulation of that one organism. Like that's the macrocosmic um, ideal that we are images of, right? Um, and so, you know, what is environment and what is organism is changing at different phases of evolution. And I think that one way of understanding what evolution is this process of the environment kind of turning itself outside in and gaining the capacity to feel itself more intimately by self-differentiating. And so the one becomes many while remaining one, in the sense that there's still one shared environment, one shared domain of life. And there's nowhere else to go, in a sense, but in, and to self-transform. And the process of evolution for both of them becomes a kind of uh this word kenosis. It's like this
Geno or K?
Kenosis, kenosis. It means self-emptying. And in Hebrew, the words tzimtzum, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but in Kabbalah, it's this notion of like, where does creation occur? Well, there was nowhere outside of God for it to occur, and so God had to make room in God's self. God had to hollow out a space in which, out of God's own body, that creation could occur. And so this is, yeah, speaking to the way in which the environment ultimately is God. And we can't understand environment in that sense anymore in a merely physical way. Steiner has these other layers of reality: the etheric, the astral, and the spiritual. And to reincorporate these, it might sound like we're adding extra stuff to what everybody already knows is real. And like, why would we want to do that? Occam's razor and all that. But, you know, Steiner borrows these terms from theosophy, the etheric, astral, and the spiritual, or the causal plane, you could say. But he's not talking about anything that isn't rooted in our phenomenology. Um, there is a difference between a corpse and a living body. Everybody knows that. What's the difference? Well, you can't measure it, can't weigh it. You just know that someone's last breath goes out of their body, and then that body becomes equivalent to the mineral world around it and immediately begins to decay. What's changed? Steiner would say, well, there's a life body, there's an etheric body, and ultimately our etheric body is inseparable from the cosmic ether. Similarly, there's an astral body, which has more to do with our emotional life, our thinking, feeling, and willing, our desires, our passions, our imagination. Like all this is happening somewhere. You're not going to find it if you look in the brain, right? There's no color, taste, etc. in that really complex but still basically material organ. And so he says that's in the astral body. Well, where is that? It's, you could think of it as higher dimensional space. And then the spirit, or the I, that's the most mysterious part of us. I mean, it's really the whole of us, but it's both fully individuated There's me, there's you, and how we feel individuated is a function of this I being at our core. And yet, I think what Steiner describes happening after death as the we lose our physical bodies first, and then we lose our etheric and astral bodies too. And all that's left is the I. And that in that state, he says, between death and a new birth, the I is no longer so individuated. It starts to see that it is um, that there's a unity that connects us all between incarnations, but that there's important work to be done when we're incarnated that requires that we feel like we're distinct beings. And so the I is somehow both one and many, right? Both a unity and a multiplicity. And so, there are all these dimensions that it seems like Steiner's trying to add to the physical, which everybody knows and accepts. But I think if we can live into it at an experiential level, it starts to make more sense why he would come up with terms for these layers that they literally don't appear in the physical world, right? And so how do we talk about them? And evolutionarily, the story he describes of these different evolutionary epochs is a function of how each of these layers came to be, right? Um, he names them after the planets. Um, the Saturn phase is when what we call our physical body developed. The Sun phase of evolution is when our etheric bodies developed. The Moon phase is when our astral bodies developed, and we carry within us the the achievements of these prior evolutionary epochs and the failures. Like there are certain scars, like things that occurred which were, say, traumatic in these prior epochs, and we carry that in us today. Um, and so, it's a very different approach to evolution, but I think it allows us to feel like our humanity is integral to the whole cosmic process rather than accidental to it. And that makes all the difference. I think not only is it more true, but I think culturally, um, the meaning crisis is in large part a function of feeling like human life is absurd, like we shouldn't even be here, uh, that life and consciousness are just these cruel jokes that the universe is playing on us. And unless we can find a way to see the universe and this process of evolution as um, to see our own consciousness as intimately connected to that and as the purpose of it ultimately, I don't know that we could deal with the crisis of meaning and the nihilism um, that's plaguing our cultural life. So, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in this, but also just purely from a philosophical point of view, like I want to understand the history of the universe. And at least for me, I've gotten to the point where I can't see human existence and consciousness as a sideshow because after all, it's we who want to know this story. And for us to attempt to know that story as if we weren't the ones seeking it seems odd to me. That seems self-contradictory, right? So as weird as Steiner can sound, it's to me becoming more plausible than the standard Big Bang story, which I see as increasingly absurd.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I find if I look deeply at why I'm drawn to any given thinker or cosmology, it has to do with how I come away contextualizing my own suffering, even just like mundane day to day feelings of disconnection or ultimate futility, anything that puts it in a context of like a sort of unconditionally viewing suffering as growth, or like as some service that we're carrying out. I mean, meaning, I guess ultimately what we mean by meaning is that we're contributing to a worth a direction. Really, there's no like final goal. The moment you give us a finality, it starts to feel meaningless. What, like, it can't be that no there's no goal, and it can't be that there's a final goal. Either one makes us feel like there's no meaning. It's kind of a loose, a weird thing to really pin down. But the sense that there's a worthwhile direction to go, and that even if we don't have it narrowed down to a particular way the world needs to look, that there's this process that transcends us, um, predates us as individuals, of course, and and maybe we are identical with this process, um, but that there's work that needs to be done, and it's happening whether we are dialed into the specifics of this process or not, like just by virtue of having shown up as a being and learning how to bear suffering without becoming resentful, just bearing suffering in service of something. I mean, maybe that's the part of the power of the Christ image, because a normal person that doesn't think too deeply, is satisfied to say Jesus died for our sins. And the image is like he suffered so that we could be forgiven. If you try to get them into the specifics of it, like, well, wait, what do we need to be forgiven for? Why couldn't God just forgive us? They might try to argue, but you'll feel from them that they think you missed the point, because the fundamentally it's just the image of like horrible suffering that's worth it, like, and that alone is like, don't read into it too much. Like, we just need something that's putting our suffering in a context that it's the same thing as like movement and growth. uh is it I mean, that's one notion of why the Christ image is powerful. What When you talk about the Christ event, um and you know you and you sort of disentangle that from any particular notion of what happened historically, um what is the significance of the Christ event, like that, just the emergence of this symbol of eternally meaningful sacrificial suffering? Is that the core in your view?
I mean, I think that's almost more the core of what
Buddhism.
Buddhism, yeah. Um, and Steiner writes explicit and lectured explicitly about this and thought of Buddha as an important figure in the evolution of consciousness, 600 years before Jesus Christ and the Christ event occurred, really emphasizing the extent to which, if the physical world is all that there is, life is suffering. And earlier forms of Buddhism were more about escape from the suffering by not identifying with anything impermanent. And later forms of Buddhism, as you get into the Mahayana and the Vajrayana traditions, and like this Bodhisattva's vow, which is like more Christic in orientation, more incarnational, I would say. It's like, no, you can't really be released from samsara until everyone is released from samsara, and so you must be reborn and come help others and alleviate their suffering. Um, that is, and this might be a controversial way of putting it, but it's like the Christification of Buddhism in a sense. It's like whether or not we call it Christ does not, or Christianity especially, is not really important. It's more this impulse to suffer with the world in service of love. But the Christ event is not just about sacrificial suffering, but about, on some level, like the insight that death is not the end of life, and that the physical body uh, is not the sole source of support for our consciousness, right? And that there is a kind of eternal life, a kind of immortality, and long before Christianity, um, there were these mystery traditions, these initiation rites that gave people a little taste of what this immortality was. And this is cross-cultural, right? This sense that there is something more beyond the death of this physical body. And I think what the Christ event did and does is gives everybody the ability to recognize what maybe used to be something you needed special initiation for. And now, like, what was secret has been, the mysteries have been opened up, made public. It's like you can't you can't look the other way at this point. Um, like, and this is a very, personal thing for me, and I think it has to be personal for everyone. And I am at least uh not attached to the name that people call this experience or this being. It's just more like this ability to love despite death and to love beyond death. And that to really take seriously the idea that just because someone you loved has died doesn't mean that your love doesn't touch them anymore, or that their love doesn't touch you anymore. And then there's a whole, you know, deepening esoteric side to this that Steiner goes into about reincarnation and multiple lifetimes. And um, I can't, I don't have an experiential grasp of any of that. But I do have a very strong sense that death is is not the end, and that being living a meaningful life as a human being today does require uh, making contact with that form of transpersonal love that isn't touched by death. And to the extent that we don't have that, we're going to have a lot of problems, psychologically, socially, because what's left, if death is the end, what's left?
Just the death not being the end for me, all the more makes it urgent that we contextualize and justify our suffering because it's never gonna end.
Yeah, there is no escape. That's true.
And so the notion that the power of the Christ image is to, like, take us beyond death and have us recognize that it's not the end and that life transcends it. Um, Maybe that provides a certain kind of relief for someone that was just really afraid of like the end, but it's not a
It's
relief to me.
yeah, it's not relief in the sense that nothing challenging will ever befall you again. It's relief in the sense that you have meaning, and meaning in life is so much more important than ease or
Why is that me? Like I was saying before, it's like if there's a hard end, it's like, well, what's the point? It ends. And if it never ends, you can just as easily get nihilistic about that. Uh, and that's why that's why just that piece of like what do I do like when I'm suffering and I can visualize an end to this suffering, but it'll lead to another form and another form. We do end up, we just need some loose, like not too stringently defined sense. And I think it's there in Whitehead that there's a creative process happening aiming at more and more beauty. Like this is it's going to go on and on and on, but it is going to keep changing. But then there's, that the Nietzschean idea, I'm sure other people as well, that you can't really get a magnification of beauty and love without its mirror in a magnification of the capacity to suffer. Um, and so yeah, it's like, the beauty and the horror, you have to like swallow it whole. Um, and maybe the job is like develop that capacity, even if you can only do it for, brief moments in this current form, to be able to hold that tension without it just scaring the shit out of you and making you want to shut your eyes to the whole thing. Um, but yeah, I think I now, when I'm reading philosophy or um, these religious figures, I don't need any help with like understanding death isn't the end. I need like comfort in light of that. And it's,
mm,
and like now when I talk to my dad, who's a materialist, and he he'll feel like he's really, being fearless by just proclaiming like how sure he is that, when we die, it's just over and don't hope for anything else. I'm like, the idea that that is scarier than but at the same time, then I think, well, there's something very merciful about the fact that we don't. I like on one level, yeah, maybe the project of imaginatively recollecting the past could be useful, but there also seems to be some built-in feature where we're not remembering too much. We just are the result of these past events, but we don't have to carry the weight. Um, and eternity is it's less scary when you're like, I'm gonna keep showing up fresh. But when when you see, or we're moving in the direction of an expanded awareness, expanded capacity for suffering and to behold beauty. And, if you smoke some changa or drink some ayahuasca, you might get a taste of what it would be like to have, your awareness ballooned by 1,000. Um, and to be able to hold a lot more awareness of the suffering, but also a lot more of the beauty. And those are incredible experiences that you end up missing and wanting more of. But then when you're in them, sometimes it makes you grateful. Like, oh, it's going to be like, it's nice when you feel yourself starting to return to a more normal state. And the idea that there's this inevitable evolution toward more and more and more and more awareness. You're like, well, maybe then we pop and we start over. Like I maybe it because it's frightening to imagine that it just keeps intensifying. But it's also exciting and cool and does give me a feeling of just wanting to know what happens, just curiosity. And uh yeah, none of this stuff can really be narrowed down to a simple feeling. um
Hmm.
Do you think it's the creative procession of the universe is toward endless intensification and expansion of consciousness, or do you think there is a zenith point and a sort of we jump back in and start over and do it again and with different results?
Seems infinite to me. I remember some of my earliest psychedelic experiences gave me this impression that like I had gone into them thinking, okay, I'm gonna pull the veil back and just see reality naked. And what I came to see was there were just more veils. There's just veils all the way down. And that can lead to a kind of nihilistic sense of like it's all Maya, it's all illusion, or that the very search is generating the Maya and I need to stop searching and just be okay with the not knowing. But then I realized, and Whitehead helps here with his idea of what reality is all about is this perpetual creative advance into novelty. It's like the veils aren't actually veils. And to recognize the role of appearance in reality and the way that the very dichotomy between appearance and reality starts to break down, it's like it's not veil after veil after veil. It's reality appearing to itself in ever more diverse and beautiful ways. And how could it be otherwise? There's no bottom to this. It's infinite. And that's emptiness, right? That's non-duality. And that doesn't mean that um suffering goes away. And I think I have learned so much from my study of Buddhism and the meager attempts to practice meditation about non-attachment. But um, I think this this vision of evolution as an ongoing uh, longing for deeper and deeper to fall more deeply in love with existence is I don't find it exhausting. I find it's just a worthy cause, and
What could be
um,
you can't even fathom anything more worthy.
yeah. Uh, and it's like, yeah, I think basically Whitehead was right that, the teleology of the universe is the production of beauty and God seeks intensity of experience. which doesn't always mean uh joy,
Mhm.
or
Do
at
you
least
know
doesn't
how
always manifest as joy.
there's that notion that, is God powerful enough to put a rock in place that he can't move, that sort of paradox. And um the last time I smoked changa and I you know, felt transpersonal for a stretch, um I had a new experience of as I was returning to my normal state, rather than feeling it as this decrease in power to where all of a sudden, rather than being able to surf the cosmos at will, I was going to be in a realm of hard objects and obligations and people that rub me the wrong way. It felt like this enhancing of a kind of power where I felt like, oh wow, I'm doing the impossible right now as the divine putting the immovable objects back in place. And I'm gonna feel like I don't want this, but I do want this because it doesn't take long, it's impossible to describe, but in that DMT state where you sort of feel omniscient, like you can just go to any part of the universe and see it how you want, and um, conjure a sexual feeling that spans the cosmos. There 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 can be something nauseating about not running into the feeling of limits that like doesn't allow a rich story to unfold. And I've been going back to that thought um over the past few weeks when I feel myself like up against something that isn't as movable as I'd like it to be in my life. And rather than that being evidence of my non-participation in the divine, it can be experienced as a sort of profound participation. Um and like not that, what we want to be doing all the time is cultivating our feeling that we are God. Uh, I mean, we do and we don't. For me, I have to be careful of it because it's resulted in grotesque ego inflation a few times. But uh, I think one of the fixes for that has been to flip how I experience my own constraints. Even just, as a thinker, like it was hard for me for a long time to, even though it'd be very obvious, just like reading the work of someone 100 times smarter than me, and reading things that I could kind of understand, but I could never write or listen, looking at the work of artists that's so far beyond anything I could ever produce. Like it's not that I wouldn't acknowledge it, but some part of me would have to justify it or say like, well, I could do that if this and that. Like it's very hard for me to get to the point where like, no, you're not the best at anything. Like you're somewhere in the middle of your species with like a little particular set of capacities, and they have their limits, and you're going to constantly be confronted by people that are better at this and better at that. uh that was, yeah, I mean, it's embarrassing now, but that was like hard for me. And I feel increasingly able to appreciate and accept my limits. um and for whatever reason, that doesn't feel as sad. It's just like, well, this is the piece of the organism I am right now. Of course I'm limited, and it probably has to do with having become a father as well, where there's when I think about what I want for my son, it's not, I don't want him to be the best. He doesn't need to be uh incredible at a bunch of things. Like if he figures out a way to like relate to people well and has like close relationships and likes himself, that to me would be a beautiful flowering of life. Um and yeah, I guess I'm learning to regard myself that way a little bit, to um yeah, to reframe what it means to thrive and see something beautiful in my limits.
Yeah. I mean, if we didn't meet resistance, we wouldn't we wouldn't even be conscious of ourselves. If we were just pure infinite will and we met no feedback, it's like we're not even aware of ourselves.
Yeah.
Um,
Right. So the limits, that's it's the feeling of self-creation, or like these walls of what I am and what I'm not, what I can do and what I can't. It's not, we're not being taunted by God in those.
yeah. Yeah, and something about beauty, I think also like we appreciate beauty because we can see that certain resistances have been overcome in order to create this, right? And without that sense, it's it cheapens it. Like, um, and that's the problem with like AI art. Like you could produce an image that's really cool and like maybe even pretty, but and interesting, but like to know that a human being didn't agonize over the creation of that by hand, it takes a lot away from our appreciation of it, you know? Um, and I think, of Whitehead's statement at the very end of Adventures of Ideas, where he talks about the dream of youth when everything is possible and we think we're infinite and um, impervious to like anything bad happening, and then the harvest of tragedy as life beats us up, but we're able to persevere that and um, achieve something beautiful despite all the scars and like the finitude even of God in Whitehead's scheme, who God's not all powerful for Whitehead. And I think something similar could be said for how Steiner conceives of the Godhead, though it's interesting in Steiner. It's like you got all these angels doing all sorts of things, but there are only a few places where he talks about like God, and often you get the feeling that he's like, don't kid yourself, like we don't need to talk about the Godhead. Like we've got infinite levels of of the um distribution of divine power here to work through. Like let's just leave that as a mystery for now. Um but I think even in what in Steiner, there's this sense that God doesn't create by fiat. It's always a collaborative affair, and there's lots of contingency and um, accidents occur, and then what the divine does is find a way to fold that into a deeper beauty by out contextualizing it. By thinking, you think that's a discordant note, but God figures out a way to fold it into this awesome jazz ensemble. And so, beauty is enhanced by the failures which precede it, right? And the scars which accumulate and the efforts to win some sense uh, of meaning from a life that's inevitably full of tragedy and loss, right? So beauty is enhanced by finitude, I would say.
Mm. And I could talk for 2 more hours. None of our conversations are complete without a um an account of beauty, suffering, and God from you. I just find like I love when you talk about those things. Um, and I would listen back to all of our conversations to get it all again if that didn't mean having to listen to myself and come up against my my own limitations in the painful way I described. Um, Man, yeah, I really appreciate these conversations, man. I have to go here in a second and return to fatherly duties, but thank you, and let's keep them going.
Yeah, I'm glad we're back in the saddle together. Appreciate your questions, the personal and transpersonal. Um, yeah, this was an excellent way to spend a Sunday morning.
Man, I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, Roman.